Hi, and welcome back. I'm going to talk about compression today, one of my favourite subjects. And I'm going to put ReaComp through its paces and see what it's capable of. ReaComp is quite a versatile compressor, capable of a range of different compression styles. But it has some quirks and peculiarities, and if you want to get the best results, it really helps to know what you're doing. I'll be mostly testing with a simple 4-bar drum loop, so it's easy to hear the changes. But before we dive into ReaComp, I'm going to take a look at FabFilter Pro-C 2, which we'll use as our first reference. I'm spanking the signal fairly hard with about 12 dB of gain reduction, using the punch style. Notice how nicely the ratio knob is scaled. 2.5 to 1 is about halfway up, so the lower half of the knob lets us explore gentle, low ratio settings, while the upper half gives us firmer compression, then into limiting. I'll stick with 4 to 1 for now. The upper half of the attack knob isn't much use for shaping drums, but about halfway up we start to get a kind of thumpy sound. A bit faster gives us more of a punchy setting. While faster still sounds tight and snappy. The attack doesn't claim to go all the way to 0, but this fastest setting is still smashing off most of the initial transients. If I back it off a little bit, that makes a big difference. Okay, let's try the release. Turning this up holds the tail of each hit back a bit longer and pushes the reverb further into the background. I can actually turn this up quite a long way before the release becomes too slow and can't recover properly between hits. Now we're only really applying about 6 dB of compression, which might sound fine. Except the first beat of the song, and the first beat after any pause, will be suddenly hit with the full amount of gain reduction and get squashed much harder. So this is best avoided. At the other end of the scale, the fastest setting is too fast. But turning it up a bit gives us nice fat drum hits, followed by dense, powerful reverb tails. I've set the knee to 0 for the hardest, most aggressive setting, so we could hear the attack and release settings more easily. Turning this up softens the knee to create a more gradual onset of compression. This can be useful when you need a lot of gain reduction, but you don't want to hear the compressor working. When shaping drums, the harder settings tend to be more useful. But sometimes it can be nice to set a very small knee of just 2 or 3 dB, just to round off the corners slightly and make the attack a bit less clicky. Okay, this is a good, powerful setting. And actually, it's not a million miles away from this. So before you start commenting furiously, no, they're not exactly the same. I haven't tried to match them perfectly. but they both do a similar job within the context of a mix, and they sound much more like each other than they do to the uncompressed drums. So let's see if we can dial in a similar sound using ReaComp. I'll pull down the threshold to start catching the peaks. And nothing happens because the ratio's all the way down. So let's turn that up. And oops, I'm at 16:1 already. In practical musical terms, there's not a great deal of difference between this setting and infinity to 1. So we can see that this parameter isn't scaled as thoughtfully as the ratio knob in Pro-C 2, and if you need very low ratios, you're going to have to hold a modifier key to fine-tune. Paying attention to these details is one of the things that makes the FabFilter plugins so ergonomic and pleasant to use. So let's try the attack time. This does claim to go to 0, unlike the FabFilter compressor. But that doesn't sound like 0 to me. And there is a reason for that. The RMS size parameter at the bottom is critical and can dramatically change the behaviour. Let's set this to 0, and now it sounds like an instant attack. So let's tweak up the attack time and see how we can shape the transients. There's tight and snappy. And there's punchy. And here's more of a thump. Above that, it ceases to be much use on drums. So again, all the real action is concentrated over on the left-hand side of the slide. Okay, the default 3 millisecond setting is pretty close to our reference. So let's take a look at the release. I'll turn it up a bit. And I quite quickly get to 2 slow settings which can't recover between hits. So we're now only applying half the gain reduction. So we need to stay below about 300 milliseconds or thereabouts. Going the other way, we can get aggressively fast. And even faster still. And what's this? The release goes all the way to 0 as well. This is kind of a crazy design choice for a compressor, as 0 release literally isn't compression anymore, it's just distortion. With 0 release and 0 attack and a 0 RMS size, the result is actually just clipping. Let's pop over to see the plugin doctor to see what's actually going on. The test signal is a sine wave at 100 Hz. I'll set attack and release to 0, RMS size to 0, ratio all the way up, and let's pull the threshold down. And watch the top of the waveform get clipped off. So eventually it looks more like a square wave than a sine. And yes, this is indeed just hard clipping, with no attempt whatsoever to preserve the shape of the sine wave during gain reduction. If we tweak up the release a tiny bit, we see this start to kick in on the trailing edge of the wave. And if I turn up the attack a bit, we see the original wave start to reassert itself on the leading edges. But interestingly, if I turn up the RMS size a bit, we see both, with smoothing of both the leading and trailing edges. And if I keep going, pretty soon we see the sine wave shape reappears. If I turn up the release to a more sensible setting, and set attack to its default, again we have enough smoothing to get back to more or less the original sine wave shape. A sensible release range is therefore going to be between about 300 milliseconds max. Down to about 50 milliseconds, or perhaps 30 milliseconds. And the real action all happens within this kind of range. I reckon about 80 milliseconds or thereabouts gets us close to our references. But how close does this actually sound? They're actually quite different. ReaComp has a grabbier attack, with the initial transient seeming slightly separated from the tail of each hit. While our references smoothly integrate the transients into a dense, powerful release. Maybe it's that tiny bit of knee I added to the FabFilter plugin. So let's add a similar tiny knee to ReaComp. Notice there's a weird knee tick box above. This really is weird. If I find a use for it, I'll let you know. The knees helped a bit, but it hasn't changed the basic character of the compression. When in peak sensing mode like this, ReaComp actually puts me more in mind of the type of feed-forward VCA compressor you might find built into the channels of a large format console. Again, no, they're not identical, but this is a lot closer than our original reference. And this type of compression could be useful on drum close mics, for example. So what about the classic attack option? And this makes that grabby attack slightly grabbier still. This might be useful for an inside kick mic, perhaps. But most of the time I prefer it off. Okay, so what about auto release? And I'll be honest, I'm not hearing much difference there. However, if I set the release much too fast, now it makes a difference. Listen to that weird slapback effect. compared to just a really fast release with it off. So that's kind of groovy. You might want to try it if you're smashing some room mics. But it's not really what I'd expect an auto release to do. And if you're working with more sensible release times, you can turn it on or off. And it doesn't really seem to matter. So maybe we need to increase the RMS size. As I increase this, notice the attack starts to gain a soft, spongy character. Let's compare it to peak sensing. And back to RMS. If we go larger, we quickly reach a point where we're not really shaping the drum transients anymore, just like increasing the attack time too far. But around 20 milliseconds, we gain a nice bouncy thwack. This sounds nothing at all like our references, but with maybe a slightly slower attack and a faster release. The sound reminds me of another famous RMS sensing feed-forward compressor. Once you've tuned your ears into that slightly squashy attack characteristic, you'll begin to recognise other parts that might benefit from it. Like certain types of bass guitar sound, for example. Or clean strat chords. In this case, I like the dynamic control I get from compressing it fairly hard. But the attack is a bit too strong and brings the part further forward in the mix than I want, so I'll tame that a bit with a nice soft knee. So I'm enjoying this DBX style RMS flavour, but it's nothing like our original reference. So let's go back to peak sensing and try something else. I'll have to reset the makeup gain to show you this properly, for reasons which will become clear. And for now I'll add the makeup gain with the channel fader instead. Now I happen to know that the 1176 is a feedback compressor, so I'm going to click the detector input menu and pick ReaComp's own output as the detector source. And now we're getting somewhere. There's feed forward again with its grabby attack. And feed back with a smoothly integrated transient and tail. But there's more to the story. Notice that in feed-forward mode, we're hitting the signal with around 12 dB of gain reduction. While in feedback mode, we get around half as much, as if the ratio has been turned down. Let's consult the plugin doctor again. Here's feed-forward with a 4:1 ratio. Well, let's switch to feedback. And sure enough, the actual ratio drops significantly. If I turn the ratio right up to infinity to 1, we get an actual ratio of only 2 to 1. Back to feed forward, and there's the infinite ratio on the graph. But if we switch the detector to listen to its own output, it now hears a compressed signal with a reduced dynamic range, so it doesn't respond as much. If you just naively switch the detector to the other side of the gain stage without changing anything else, you end up with half the ratio. So feedback compression gets us much closer to our original reference, except we can only do gentle ratios of 2 to 1 or lower. There are some other disadvantages as well. Switching to feedback literally takes the signal from the output of the plugin. So when I adjust the wet level slider, it also affects the amount of compression. It's not the end of the world, you can adjust the threshold to compensate. But this has effectively become an input gain rather than an output gain. It gets weirder, however, if I try to mix in some of the dry signal to do parallel compression. This also drives the compression harder. Again, you can adjust the threshold to compensate, but frankly, it's just confusing and strange. And finally, because we have to use the detector input menu to switch to feedback mode, we can't use the aux inputs, so we can't do things like sidechain EQ. But let's not focus on the negatives. One of the reasons I like Pro-C 2 is because it can give me that aggressive 1176 style with lower ratios. So here's Pro-C 2 with a 2 to 1 ratio. And here's ReaComp in feedback mode. And these sound much more similar than they did before. Now, spoiler alert, there is actually a way to get higher ratios from ReaComp without losing this feedback compression style. But before I show you that, I'll take this opportunity to compare the oversampling in both plugins. Let's start with Pro-C 2, and I'll try the maximum 4 times option. That sounds pretty much the same, right? Is that even doing anything? Okay, let's try ReaComp. The oversampling option is at the bottom, labelled AA. And this goes up to a maximum 64 times. So that's 16 times better than the FabFilter, right? And actually, maybe that does sound a bit better. Can you hear the difference? Let's consult the plugin doctor again and see if all is as it seems. Let's start with the FabFilter plugin. Ratio is all the way down, so it's not actually doing any compression. And the output frequency response is a ruler flat line at unity. No changes whatsoever. Now let's switch to 2 times oversampling. And now it's still perfectly flat until we get just above 20 kHz, where it plummets down very steeply. The doctor is set to test at 44.1 kHz, so this is the most challenging scenario. But the results look essentially perfect. This is exactly what I'd expect high-quality anti-aliasing filters to look like. Let's check it 4 times, and no difference. Okay, let's check the phase. With no oversampling, there's no shift. This is linear phase. And with 2 times oversampling, still linear phase. Good job, guys. These filters are basically perfect, except for a bit of latency. But how well do they reduce aliasing? Let's switch to harmonic analysis. And I want to generate a harmonic series, so let's bring up the ratio, fastest attack and release, hardest knee, and we can see quite clearly here a harmonic series that gets reflected back down when it hits the Nyquist limit at half the sample rate. So let's try 2 times oversampling. And those reflected, aliased harmonics are now significantly lower in level, as they're now reflecting back from a Nyquist limit 1 octave higher. 4 times oversampling, and they drop further still, to levels that we can consider negligible. So that's what proper oversampling should look like. Now let's try ReaComp. With no compression and no oversampling, the frequency response is a flat line again, as you'd expect. Let's try 2 times oversampling. And that's unfortunate. The filter kicks in rather early, at around 10K, and we're losing a significant amount of the air frequencies above that. That's a shame. So how about 64 times oversampling? Now we get a funny little bump at around 10K, and everything below that gets louder by about a decibel. So if you heard an improvement earlier, it was actually just getting a little bit louder. Let's check the phase. Phase shift is inevitable for oversampling filters if you can't have latency. But I would normally expect much more phase shift concentrated in the upper frequencies, as I would normally expect much steeper filters. So let's see how well these reduce aliasing. First, we need to generate some harmonics, which is pretty easy with ReaComp in its not a compressor hard clipping mode. So there we see a nice harmonic series that reflects back down at Nyquist. And let's see how 2 times oversampling affects that. We saw the low-pass filter kick in, but those reflected, aliased harmonics didn't change in level at all. Let's try 64 times. Still no difference. So basically the oversampling doesn't work. Right now there's a bug, or it's not been implemented correctly. Don't bother with it. That's a shame. If it was fixed, ReaComp could be a killer clipping or saturation plugin. But let's keep it in perspective. Lots of successful commercial compressor plugins don't have oversampling. The original Pro-C didn't. The original virtual mix rack didn't. So let's focus on the positives, like the fact that ReaComp uses basically no CPU at all. Which means it doesn't really matter if I need 2 instances to get the results I want. Let's float this one too, and I'll rename them so I know which is which. I'll call the first one Pre-Comp, and the second Comp. Now I'm going to keep both set exactly the same, except I'll switch the second instance back to feed-forward mode, so it's listening to its input rather than its output. Now we have compressor 1, which is listening to the output of compressor 1, and compressor 2, which is also listening to the output of compressor 1. If they've got identical settings and identical signals hitting the sidechain, they should produce identical results. And watching the gain reduction meters seems to back up my theory. Let's hop over to the doctor again. Here's 2 instances of ReaComp patched in series. If I turn up the ratio all the way for the first instance, we get a 2:1 ratio, as it's set to feedback mode. The second instance is in feed-forward mode, and if I turn up the ratio all the way, we get the other half of the gain reduction, which makes a hard limiter. If I drop the ratio of the second compressor to 2:1, we get a nice 1176 style 4:1 overall ratio. So I've linked the threshold of the first compressor to the threshold of the second, so I can control them both together easily. And likewise the knee. And you could go ahead and link all the controls if you want. Another advantage, the wet slider on the second compressor now functions as a proper makeup gain control, without changing the amount of compression. Unfortunately, the dry fader still doesn't quite do what we want, as it gives us the output of the first compressor rather than the dry signal. And likewise, we can't do sidechain EQ, because the second compressor has to be listening to its input, and the first compressor has to be listening to its output. But if you link the high and low pass filter sliders, they'll work as they should at least. So let's compare to our 1176 style reference. Again, not identical, but pretty close. But what if I told you there was a way to get this type of compression sound, plus many other variations, while still being able to use the dry slider for parallel compression, and also being able to patch in an EQ for the sidechain? I call this the fabulous fake feedback trick. But I've gone on for long enough already in this video, so that'll have to wait for next time. Thanks for watching.